The sun blazes mercilessly over the arid landscape of the Brazilian Badlands. Dust swirls through the air, stinging the eyes of anyone unfortunate enough to stand still for too long. The land seems to stretch forever, barren and hostile, but in the distance, a group of men move like ghosts, their silhouettes barely visible against the horizon. They are the notorious cangaceiros, and they are about to face an unimaginable challenge. 200 soldiers, armed and ready, had been sent to crush the infamous Lampião and his gang, a band of outlaws who had become the stuff of legend. They had tracked them for days, cornered them in this unforgiving desert, and prepared to end the reign of terror that had haunted the region for so long. The soldiers thought they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who they were up against. Lampião, or Virgilino Ferreira da Silva, had earned his reputation as a brilliant strategist, and he was no stranger to outwitting the law. With his gang of fiercely loyal men, he had already outmaneuvered countless attempts to capture or kill him. But this would be different. This would test not just his skills, but the very core of his leadership. As the soldiers advanced through the rough terrain, they were unaware of the trap being set. Lampião and his men had blended into the desert landscape, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. They knew the terrain like the back of their hands. This wasn't just the battlefield, it was their home turf. The soldiers, heavy with equipment and unaccustomed to the harsh conditions, were walking right into the lion's den. Just as the soldiers neared a narrow pass, Lampião gave the signal. The cangaceiros, hidden in the hills, unleashed a devastating volley of gunfire. The soldiers scattered, but it was too late. The outlaws had the advantage of terrain and timing, and they knew exactly how to strike when the enemy least expected it. In the chaos that followed, the soldiers were overwhelmed. Lampião's men moved quickly, their attacks coming from all directions. They used guerrilla tactics, making the most of the terrain to disorient and outsmart the larger force. The soldiers, confused and frightened, were forced to retreat. Lampião's gang, though outnumbered and outgunned, had turned the tables in a matter of minutes. The ambush was a resounding success. Despite the odds, Lampião and his gang had not only survived but had sent a powerful message to those who sought to end their reign of terror. They were not just criminals. They were tacticians, masters of the land they controlled, and anyone who underestimated them would pay the price. Now, let me ask you, have you ever wondered how far a group of outlaws could go when they know their environment better than their enemies? Stay with me as we dive deeper into Lampião's strategies and how he managed to outsmart an entire army with nothing but sheer wit and knowledge of the land. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on this incredible ambush. Don't forget to hit like and check if you're subscribed, because there's much more coming your way. Let's dive into the mind of Lampião and uncover the tactics that made him a legend. Virgilino Ferreira da Silva, better known as Lampião, wasn't just a bandit, he was a brilliant military strategist who understood the art of war better than many trained generals of his time. To understand how Lampião and his gang managed to outsmart and defeat their enemies time and time again, we must dive deep into the mind of this ruthless leader and explore the tactics that made him a legend. First, we need to understand that Lampião wasn't simply relying on brute force. Unlike many of his contemporaries who charged into battle with little more than their courage and weapons, Lampião was a master of deception, psychological warfare, and, most importantly, knowledge of the terrain. His ability to think several steps ahead made him nearly invincible in the rugged, unforgiving environment of Brazil's northeast. One of the most notable aspects of Lampião's strategy was his exceptional use of the terrain. The Badlands, or Caatinga, where he and his gang operated, were an inhospitable desert filled with cactus, thorn bushes, and jagged rocks. Most of his enemies, whether local authorities or soldiers sent to capture him, weren't familiar with the land. But for Lampião, it was second nature. He knew every hidden cave, every water source, every path through the brush. Lampião didn't just use the environment to escape or hide, he used it as a weapon. His band would often set ambushes in narrow passes, where their enemies were easy targets. By attacking when the enemy was most vulnerable, Lampião turned their overconfidence into their greatest weakness. The soldiers who thought they had him cornered in the desert often found themselves trapped by his cunning use of the land. But it wasn't just his knowledge of the environment that made him so dangerous. Lampião's ability to manipulate people and instill fear was another key to his success. He knew how to control not only his enemies, but also his own men. Loyalty was paramount in his gang, and Lampião ensured that everyone under his command knew exactly what was at stake. Through a combination of respect and fear, he maintained absolute control over the cangaceiros. Lampião was also a master of psychological warfare. His reputation alone was enough to instill terror in the hearts of those who heard his name. To his enemies, he was a ghost impossible to capture, and seemingly always one step ahead. Lampião carefully crafted his image, using both the brutality of his actions and the mysticism surrounding the cangaceiros to make himself appear invincible. He knew that fear could be just as powerful as a bullet, if not more so. One of the most famous examples of Lampião's psychological tactics was his use of the Lampião itself, Alar's flaming lantern that he would carry into battle. The sight of the flickering flame in the darkened desert, often accompanied by the eerie howls of the cangaceiros, became a symbol of his terrifying presence. This symbol, combined with his ruthless actions, created an aura of invincibility that spread far and wide. Even those who had never seen him feared his gang. The Lampião wasn't just a tool for light, it was a tool for terror. Another aspect of Lampião's brilliance was his use of guerrilla tactics. His gangue wasn't an army in the traditional sense. They didn't rely on conventional strategies or large-scale battles. Instead, Lampião and his men fought with speed and precision, striking when least expected and vanishing into the desert before the authorities could respond. This hit-and-run style of warfare made it nearly impossible for his enemies to pin him down. His gang could appear out of nowhere and just as quickly disappear into the wilderness, leaving nothing behind but the aftermath of their attack. Lampião's ability to maintain control in such chaotic conditions was a testament to his leadership. While other outlaws relied on brute force and intimidation, Lampião's leadership was grounded in strategy, psychology, and an understanding of human nature. He didn't just lead through fear, he led through calculated, precise actions that kept both his enemies and his followers guessing. His men, the cangaceiros, were fiercely loyal, not only because of their fear of Lampião, but because they believed in his vision. They saw him not just as a leader, but as a figure who could lead them to victory in a world that had long forgotten them. In many ways, Lampião became a symbol of resistance, a force that stood against the oppressive forces of the Brazilian government and the military. Now, let's stop for a moment and think, have you ever faced a challenge where preparation and knowledge were the key to your success? Lampião's story isn't just about battles, it's about how far a man can go when he understands the game better than anyone else. Stay with me as we explore the next chapter in Lampião's tactics, where we'll look at the role of Maria Bonita in the Cangaco and how she helped cement Lampião's power. When we think of the cangaceiros, the first name that often comes to mind is Virgilino Ferreira da Silva, known as Lampião. But if we take a deeper look into the history of Cangaco, one name stands out just as strongly, perhaps even more so in some ways: Maria Bonita, a woman who didn't just walk alongside the cangaceiros but stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who would become the most feared outlaw in Brazilian history. Maria Bonita wasn't just the partner of Lampião, she was his equal in strategy, in courage, and in the brutal world they lived in. Maria Bonita, born Maria Gomes de Oliveira, entered the world of Cangaco not out of necessity, but as a fierce and willing participant. At just 16 years old, she joined Lampião's gang, and her story quickly became one of legend. In a time when women were largely expected to stay within the confines of the home, Maria Bonita broke every boundary, defying societal norms to fight alongside the very men who terrorized the Brazilian Northeast. Her decision wasn't an impulsive one, it was a calculated choice driven by both necessity and a deep sense of rebellion. What made Maria Bonita stand out among the cangaceiros was her extraordinary bravery and tactical insight. She was not merely a symbol of romanticized rebellion. She was a skilled warrior who wielded a rifle just as effectively as any man in Lampiao's gang. In a world dominated by male violence, Maria Bonita's role in the cangaceiros was as vital as it was revolutionary. She proved that women could not only endure the brutal life of the Cangaco, but thrive within it. Lampiao, who was known for his brilliant strategy and cold calculation, found in Maria Bonita not only a companion, but a co-strategist. She was involved in planning many of the gang's most daring attacks. Her contribution to the tactical brilliance that kept the gang one step ahead of the Brazilian military was undeniable. She learned quickly, adapting to the guerrilla warfare tactics that made the cangaceiros so effective in their attacks. Whether it was setting ambushes, laying traps, or planning escape routes, Maria Bonita was integral to the gang's success. What's even more remarkable is that Maria Bonita didn't just fight beside Lampiao, she led when he couldn't. There are accounts that describe her as a fearless leader, taking charge during Lampiao's temporary absences or when he was injured. Her ability to command respect from the other members of the gang was extraordinary. She was seen as a figure of power, not just as the partner of a leader, but as an authority in her own right. But it wasn't just her tactical mind that earned her a place in the Cangaco's brutal history, it was her sheer fearlessness. Maria Bonita wasn't afraid to face the dangers that came with living a life of constant violence. She wore the same clothes as the men, carried the same weapons, and faced the same risks. In a world where outlaws were often seen as little more than savages, Maria Bonita stood out as a symbol of defiance and strength. Her role in the cangaceiros wasn't just about fighting. Maria Bonita was also a symbol of rebellion against the oppressive forces of the government and the military that sought to crush the outlaw movement. Together with Lampiao, she became a figurehead of resistance, a woman who was not afraid to live outside the conventions of society in order to carve out a place for herself in history. Maria Bonita proved that gender was no barrier to being a fierce fighter and a brilliant tactician. However, it wasn't just her fearlessness that made Maria Bonita stand out. It was also her ability to inspire loyalty among the men of the gang. While most of the cangaceiros were fierce warriors in their own right, Maria Bonita's leadership went beyond mere physical strength. She commanded respect through her actions, her dedication to the cause, and her unwavering resolve to stand alongside Lampiao through thick and thin. Maria Bonita's legacy is not just tied to her relationship with Lampiao, but also to the role she played in the Cangaco movement. She wasn't merely an accessory to the legend of Lampiao, she was, in many ways, the embodiment of the spirit of the cangaceiros, fierce, loyal, and unyielding in the face of impossible odds. Her place in history is not one of passive support, but one of active, strategic participation in the gang's many triumphs and defeats. Her story reminds us that the world of the cangaceiros wasn't just a man's world. It was a place where women like Maria Bonita could rise to the occasion, face down death, and command their own destinies. In a life full of violence, betrayal, and bloodshed, Maria Bonita was more than just a figure in the shadows of history. She was a warrior, a leader, and a symbol of resistance in the face of tyranny. Now, let me ask you, have you ever wondered what it must have been like to live as an outlaw, constantly fighting against the world? Maria Bonita's story is a testament to the strength and courage of those who choose to fight, not just for survival, but for something bigger than themselves. If you're intrigued by her role in the Cangaco, stick with me as we explore the brutal punishments and psychological tactics that kept Lampiao's gang at the top in the dusty, unforgiving lands of the Brazilian Northeast, where the heat could break a man's spirit and the endless landscape seemed to stretch into eternity. There was a force far more terrifying than the landscape itself. It was the psychological warfare of Lampiao and his gang. Their enemies were often caught not by the precision of their strikes, but by the terror they left in their wake. The cangaceiros didn't just fight, they controlled minds, shaped fears, and manipulated perceptions. Lampiao's genius wasn't just in his tactics, it was in his understanding of how fear could be wielded as a weapon. Lampiao knew that to win a battle, you didn't always have to engage in direct combat. Sometimes, the mere threat of violence was enough to weaken the resolve of your enemy. The cangaceiros used fear as a weapon, but it wasn't just brute fear, it was psychological. A fear designed to break spirits. Before the first shot was ever fired, it's said that a single mention of Lampião's name was enough to send chills down the spines of entire villages. His name wasn't just feared, it was dreaded, whispered about in terror. But how did Lampião create this fear? The answer lies in how he carefully crafted his image. Unlike many other bandits of his time, Lampião didn't just rob and kill, he built a reputation. He understood the power of myth, and he used it to his advantage. Lampião became a symbol of terror long before he even arrived in a town. Stories about his cruelty, his violence, and his invincibility spread like wildfire. Every town he passed through would remember the horror he left behind, and soon his reputation alone was enough to make people tremble. This was no accident. Lampião and his gang were known for leaving behind a trail of destruction, not just in terms of bodies, but in terms of broken morale. The cangaceiros would target the most visible symbols of authority: police stations, military outposts, and government officials. But they didn't just destroy these symbols, they made a spectacle of it. By humiliating their enemies in public, by burning down the very symbols of law and order, Lampião and his men created a message far more lasting than any physical victory could ever be. One of the most chilling examples of this psychological warfare came in the form of their treatment of captives. When a soldier or police officer was captured by their fate wasn't just death, it was humiliation. Many captives were forced to march in front of the cangaceiros, paraded through towns like animals in a cruel show of power. This wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about breaking their spirit, making them feel small and powerless before a force they couldn't comprehend. But it wasn't just about humiliating the enemy, it was about showing the civilians who lived under the cangaceiros' rule what would happen if they defied them. Lampião knew that terror was a tool for control. The local populations were often forced into submission, not just by the threat of physical violence, but by the constant psychological pressure of living under the shadow of the cangaceiros. The civilians would live in fear of what might happen next, of who might be targeted, of whether or not they would be the next to face the wrath of the cangaceiros. Lampião didn't just control his gang through fear, he controlled entire towns, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where everyone was a potential informant or a victim. And it worked. People learned to obey because the consequences of disobedience were far worse than the price of submission. To defy Lampião wasn't just to risk that, it was to risk being erased from history itself. But the most frightening aspect of Lampião's psychological warfare wasn't just his ability to instill fear, it was his ability to manipulate people into compliance without even needing to lay a hand on them. Lampião, men were more than just bandits. They were enforcers of a system that preyed on the vulnerability of human nature. By making people believe they had no choice but to obey, by making them feel that resistance was futile, Lampião created a world where survival depended on submission. The fear was so widespread that it became a part of the culture in the Northeast. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of the cangaceiros, knowing that defiance could mean a slow and agonizing death. And those who weren't directly involved in the Cangaco learned to live with the terror that ran through their communities. In a world where law enforcement was weak and the government's reach was limited, Lampião's gang was a force that could not be ignored, and in many ways, they were more powerful than the official state itself. Now, I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where fear completely controlled your actions? Where the idea of defying authority felt impossible because of the repercussions? Lampião's world wasn't just about violence, it was about a constant, unrelenting atmosphere of fear that permeated every aspect of life. This psychological control was just as powerful, if not more so, than the weapons they carried. In the unforgiven wastelands of Brazil's northeast, there was one thing that kept the cangaceiros united in their brutal fight against the establishment. A code. It wasn't a code of honor in the traditional sense, and it certainly wasn't about mercy. It was a code built on loyalty, fear, and survival. A code that made the cangaceiros a brotherhood like no other. To understand the power of this outlaw society, we must delve into the unspoken rules that governed the cangaceiros and how this code both held them together and propelled them toward acts of unimaginable brutality. First, it's important to recognize that the cangaceiros weren't just a gang of bandits, they were a community, a tight-knit brotherhood bound by necessity and survival. In a world where betrayal was common, where loyalty could be easily bought and sold, the cangaceiros maintained a sense of unity that was ironclad. For them, the gang was family, and the laws that governed the Cangaco were as strict as any military hierarchy. At the heart of this brotherhood was the unquestionable loyalty to the leader Lampião. While his strategic mind and brutal tactics earned him respect, it was his ability to command unwavering loyalty from his men that made him untouchable. His word was law, and defying him wasn't just a matter of disobedience, it was treason. In the Cangaco, betrayal was the ultimate crime, one punishable by death. The concept of loyalty to the gang and to the cause was more sacred than any personal bond. The punishment for betrayal wasn't just about killing the traitor, it was about sending a message. Lampião and his gang were known to make examples out of those who defied them, using cruelty and spectacle as a means of reinforcing their dominance. This wasn't just about ensuring discipline within the ranks, it was about terrifying the public and crushing any hope of resistance. To betray the gang was to face a fate far worse than mere death. It was to be erased from history, wiped out as though you had never existed at all. But loyalty wasn't just demanded from the gang members. It was expected from the communities they terrorized. People who lived under the shadow of the cangaceiros were expected to turn a blind eye to their actions, to give them food, shelter, and information when requested. The locals knew that to resist or refuse was to invite the wrath of the outlaws. For the cangaceiros, loyalty wasn't just a personal trait, it was a tool of control, a way to ensure that no one would dare defy them. The line between loyalty and fear was often blurred, and the consequences of crossing it were brutal. The brutality of the cangaceiros was a natural extension of their code. To survive in a world as harsh as the Brazilian Badlands, where the law was as barren as the land itself, brutality was a necessity. The cangaceiros were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting to carve out a place for themselves in a world that had long forgotten them. Their brutal tactics were a means of asserting control over the land, and they were willing to do anything to maintain their dominance. For them, brutality wasn't just a strategy, it was their identity. One of the most chilling aspects of the cangaceiros code was how it justified their violence. Unlike other criminal organizations that might engage in random acts of terror or senseless killing, the cangaceiros saw their violence as a form of justice. They believed they were the rightful rulers of the land, punishing the corrupt authorities and the wealthy elites who had long exploited the poor. In their eyes, every life they took, every punishment they inflicted, was a step toward a more just society where the cangaceiros were in control. This sense of righteous brutality was particularly evident in the cangaceiros' treatment of captured soldiers or laymen. When the cangaceiros caught members of the military or police forces, they didn't just kill them, they humiliated them. They made them suffer, often in public, as a way to show that the law had no power in the Badlands. The brutal killings weren't random, they were methodical, meant to break the spirit of the enemy and send a message to everyone who might dare cross them. However, this brutal code wasn't without its cracks. The cangaceiros, like all outlaw groups, were a product of their environment, and their loyalty to each other was often tested by greed, jealousy, and personal vendettas. Disputes between members of the gang were not uncommon, and betrayal wasn't always a clear-cut matter. In some cases, it was simply the result of personal grudges or power struggles within the group. But even in these moments of internal conflict, the gang maintained its core principle, loyalty to the group above all else. At the same time, the code of the cangaceiros allowed for a certain level of freedom and autonomy. Unlike more rigid military structures, the cangaceiros operated in a way that allowed each individual member to exercise a degree of independence. They were united by a shared purpose, but each gang member had the freedom to make decisions within the framework of that purpose. This autonomy helped to foster a sense of brotherhood and allowed the cangaceiros to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Ultimately, the code of the cangaceiros was about survival. It was about creating a system where loyalty, fear, and brutality were the foundations of their existence. Lampião and his gang weren't just fighting against the law, they were fighting for the survival of their way of life. They understood that in a world where the weak were crushed by the powerful, loyalty to each other was their only weapon against a society that had long abandoned them. Betrayal, one of the deadliest sins in the world of the cangaceiros. To defy Lampião and his gang was to risk more than just physical harm. It was to invite a fate so cruel that even the toughest men in the gang would tremble at the thought. The world of the cangaceiros was a harsh one, built on loyalty, survival, and fear, and those who broke their sacred code of loyalty were met with punishments so brutal they would send shivers down your spine. The punishment for betrayal was not swift. It was not merciful. Betrayal in Lampião's world wasn't just a personal failing, it was an affront to the entire gang. The cangaceiros code demanded absolute loyalty, and anyone who broke that trust was made to suffer not just for their own transgression, but as an example to others. To betray the gang meant not only death, but death by a slow, painful process that would send a message to anyone who might be tempted to do the same. The punishment for treason wasn't just about revenge. It was a methodical process of psychological and physical destruction, designed to break not only the individual traitor but to ensure that the rest of the gang remained in line. The cangaceiros were known for their brutality, but it wasn't just mindless. Violence was calculated, deliberate, and designed to ensure the survival of the gang and the continuation of their mission. One of the most infamous examples of betrayal within the gang involved a cangaceiro named Zizinho. According to stories passed down from the survivors of the gang, Zizinho was a young and promising member of Lampião's band. He had earned the trust of the leader and had fought bravely alongside the cangaceiros in numerous raids. But one fateful night, Zizinho made a deadly mistake. He betrayed the gang. The exact nature of his betrayal remained shrouded in mystery. But the consequences were clear. The punishment was swift and brutal. Zizinho was captured by the cangaceiros after his betrayal was uncovered. According to some accounts, Lampião himself passed the judgment, understanding that the example made of Zizinho would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider turning against the gang. The punishment for Zizinho's treason was one of the most chilling in cangaceiro history. Zizinho was tied to a tree in the middle of the desert, left to suffer under the scorching sun. The cangaceiros took their time with him, ensuring that his pain was prolonged. They knew that the fear of what would happen to a traitor would keep the rest of the gang in line. The desert heat was a natural tool of torture, slow, unrelenting, and suffocating. But it wasn't just the heat that would eventually break Zizinho. His fate was sealed when the cangaceiros began to torment him psychologically, whispering to him about the consequences of his betrayal. They made him understand that he had lost not only his life but the respect and honor of his fellow. This brutal punishment was not an isolated incident. It was the way things were done in the world of the cangaceiros. Treason wasn't just punished, it was eradicated, made into a lesson for anyone who might question the loyalty required to be part of Lampião's gang. No one was above the code, not even the most trusted cangaceiros, and those who betrayed it were condemned not just to death, but to a death that would ensure they were never remembered as heroes. But it wasn't just the fear of physical punishment that kept the cangaceiros loyal to each other, it was the psychological warfare they waged on anyone who even thought about betraying the gang. Betrayal meant not only personal death, it meant erasure. The cangaceiros didn't just kill their traitors, they erased their existence. Their names were never spoken again, and their memories were buried in the desert along with their bodies. In the brutal world of the cangaceiros, treason meant complete and total annihilation. But what made this punishment so effective was the silence that followed. The gangue didn't just execute traitors, they made sure that every member understood the consequences of betrayal in silence. The fear of what might happen if you stepped out of line was so great that even the most hardened men in the gang would think twice before disobeying Lampião's commands. This psychological control, this manipulation of fear and loyalty, was one of the key elements that allowed Lampião to maintain control over his gang for so long. What's perhaps most terrifying about the cangaceiros' approach to betrayal is the precision with which they carried it out. They didn't just kill their enemies, they made them suffer in ways that left deep psychological scars. And by doing so, they ensured that no one ever dared to defy them again. This was the true power of the cangaceiros, not just their strength in numbers, but their ability to make everyone fear them. To fear the punishment that would come not just from the violence, but from the complete obliteration of one's existence. So, let me ask you, if you had to live under a code so strict, so unforgiving, would you be willing to face the consequences of betrayal? In a world where the price of loyalty was death for those who strayed, how far would you go to maintain your honor? The cangaceiros, with their notorious reputation and relentless brutality, left behind a legacy that continues to captivate and haunt the Brazilian Northeast to this day. But beyond the stories of violence and defiance against the government, there lies a deeper mystery, one that remains shrouded in secrecy. The true depth of the cangaceiros' legacy is not just in their terror and rebellion. It's in the countless untold stories, the hidden rituals, and the unanswered questions that linger in the dust of the Badlands. One of the greatest mysteries of the cangaceiros is the question of their origins. While many of the stories surrounding Lampião and his gang are well known, the full history of their rise to power remains unclear. How did these outlaws, once considered mere bandits, become an almost mythical force capable of defying both the military and the government? Some historians believe that the rise of the cangaceiros was a direct response to the extreme poverty and lawlessness of the region, where the government's control barely extended beyond the cities. Others argue that their origins were more complicated, rooted in a mixture of rebellion against both the rich landowners and the oppressive forces of the state. What makes the cangaceiros story even more mysterious is the way they operated. Unlike other outlaw groups who fought for personal gain, the cangaceiros believed they were fighting for a cause. They saw themselves as the defenders of the poor and oppressed, taking from the wealthy and giving to those in need. This sense of purpose, however twisted, was one of the reasons Lampião and his gang were able to maintain such a strong following for so long. But how much of this ideology was genuinely believed by the gang, and how much of it was merely a tool to justify their brutality? That question remains unanswered, and perhaps it's one of the reasons their legacy is so complicated. Another mystery surrounding the cangaceiros is their use of mysticism and religious symbolism. The cangaceiros were not only warriors, they were also deeply influenced by a mixture of folk beliefs, superstitions, and Catholicism. It is said that they believed they were invincible, protected by divine forces, and many of the rituals they practiced were steeped in religious symbolism. Some cangaceiros wore amulets and charms, believing they had the power to ward off bullets or bring them victory. Others practiced secret rituals, which they believed granted them special powers. These rituals, many of which remain a mystery to this day, were not just about survival in battle. They were part of the gang's identity, a way to bond and unite in their brutal existence. One of the most chilling aspects of the cangaceiros' mysticism was their belief in the power of the curanderoa, type of healer or shaman who was said to have the ability to protect them from harm and guide them through difficult times. The curandero was often consulted before battles, and some believe that they played a central role in the decision-making process within the gang. This mysticism, combined with their violent tactics, created a sense of invincibility that allowed the cangaceiros to face down entire armies and military forces. But while the cangaceiros may have been feared, they were also revered by some to the local populations who lived under their rule. They were not just outlaws, they were heroes, protectors, and symbols of resistance in the eyes of the oppressed. The cangaceiros were the only ones who dared to stand up against the powerful landowners and the government forces that kept them subjugated. This sense of loyalty and admiration was one of the key factors that helped the cangaceiros survive for as long as they did. Yet, as time went on and the cangaceiros' power began to wane, their legacy became more complicated. The line between heroism and villainy began to blur. Some viewed them as symbols of resistance, while others saw them as violent criminals who caused more harm than good. After the death of Lampião in 1938, the cangaceiros slowly faded into history, their bandit lifestyle becoming increasingly irrelevant as Brazil moved toward modernization. But despite their decline, their legend lived on. and the mysteries surrounding their legacy only deepened. The truth is that much of what we know about the cangaceiros comes from fragmented accounts, rumors, and myths. Their true motivations, beliefs, and rituals remain shrouded in mystery. What's left behind are the stories told by those who lived through their reign of terror, and the artifacts like the clothes they wore, the weapons they carried, and the songs they sang that still hold clues to their legacy. The most haunting aspect of the cangaceiros' legacy is that many of the questions surrounding them may never be answered. The records of their existence were scattered, their rituals hidden, and their stories erased by time and the political forces that sought to suppress them. But even in the absence of concrete answers, the cangaceiros continue to captivate our imaginations. They are a symbol of rebellion, of resistance against the forces that seek to control us, and of the mysterious ways in which power can be wielded. So, what remains of the cangaceiros' legacy? We may never fully understand it, but one thing is clear: their story is far from over. The mysteries they left behind continue to intrigue and inspire us, and their influence can still be felt in the region they once controlled. The cangaceiros may have faded into history, but their legend endures. Have you ever encountered a story that leaves more questions than answers? That's the reality of the cangaceiros' legacy. If you're intrigued by the mysticism and myths surrounding them, leave a comment below. What do you think is the most fascinating aspect of their story? And if you haven't already, make sure to hit like and subscribe to continue exploring the dark and twisted history of the cangaceiros. When we think of legendary outlaws, it's easy to imagine them relying on sheer brute force to win their battles. But for Lampião and his band of cangaceiros, their strength lay not just in their physical prowess, but in their mastery of weapons and guerrilla warfare. In the unforgiving landscape of Brazil's and Northeast, where terrain could either be your greatest asset or your worst enemy, the cangaceiros became masters at using what they had to survive. And what they had were weapons specifically, weapons designed for the brutal, hit-and-run tactics that made them so effective at outsmarting and outlasting the military forces sent to capture them. To understand the cangaceiros' weaponry is to understand their approach to warfare. These weren't men who stood toe-to-toe in pitched battles. They didn't line up in neat rows and fire their rifles in an orderly fashion. No, the cangaceiros were guerrilla fighters, skilled in ambushes, surprise attacks, and using the terrain to their advantage. Every weapon they carried, every tool in their arsenal, was chosen to complement their stealthy, unpredictable style of fighting. Their weapons weren't just for killing, they were tools of terror and control. The most iconic weapon of the cangaceiros, and perhaps the most feared, was the rifle. Lampião himself was known for his skill with a rifle, and his men followed suit. The rifles were often custom-made or modified to fit the needs of the cangaceiros, allowing them to fire with precision and at great distances. But it wasn't just the power of the rifle that made it so deadly, it was the way it was used. The cangaceiros would rarely engage in open battles, preferring instead to strike from concealed positions, ambushing their enemies when they were most vulnerable. The rifle was the perfect tool for this kind of warfare, silent, efficient, and deadly from a distance. However, rifles were not the only weapons in the cangaceiros' arsenal. Lampião and his gang also wielded pistols, machetes, and even knife tools that allowed them to fight up close when necessary. The machete, in particular, was a symbol of the cangaceiros. It wasn't just a weapon for battle, it was a tool for survival. In the dense, thorny brush of the Badlands, the machete was essential for cutting through the undergrowth and carving paths through the wilderness. But when used as a weapon, it was just as deadly. The cangaceiros were known for their ability to fight hand-to-hand with machetes, their attacks swift and precise, capable of dealing lethal blows in an instant. In addition to their firearms and blades, the cangaceiros also skilled with improvised weapons. They would often fashion tools from the materials available to them in the wilderness, things like rocks, branches, and even traps designed to catch or injure their enemies. They understood that in the harsh environment of the Brazilian Northeast, survival often depended on resourcefulness, and the cangaceiros were nothing if not resourceful. They turned everyday objects into deadly tools, making use of whatever they could find to gain the upper hand in a fight. But it wasn't just their weaponry that made the cangaceiros so formidable, it was how they used their weapons in combination with their knowledge of the land. The Brazilian Badlands, or Caatinga, were a natural fortress for the They knew the terrain, like the back of their hands. Every hill, every valley, every water source was familiar to them. This intimate knowledge of the land allowed them to use their weapons in ways that military forces who were often unfamiliar with the environment simply couldn't match. For example, when the cangaceiros would ambush a military convoy, they would often do so in narrow passes or hidden ravines where their enemies had little room to maneuver. From these hidden positions, they would unleash devastating fire from their rifles, pick off targets one by one, and then retreat into the wilderness before their enemies could regroup. The terrain worked in their favor, allowing them to strike with deadly precision and then vanish, without a trace. The cangaceiros didn't just rely on their weapons in battle, they used them to control the local population. In a world where the state's authority barely extended beyond the cities, the cangaceiros became the law in the Badlands. Their weapons were symbols of their power, and they used them to demand loyalty and submission from the people who lived in the area. Villagers were often forced to provide food, shelter, and information to the cangaceiros, and those who resisted were made examples of. Lampião and his gang knew that fear was just as important as firepower, and they wielded both with ruthless efficiency. But it wasn't just about instilling fear, it was about building a reputation. The cangaceiros used their weapons to create an aura of invincibility. Stories of their deadly ambushes, their precision with rifles, and their brutality in close combat spread quickly, making them legends in their own time. The sight of the cangaceiros, armed to the teeth with distinctive rifles and machetes, became a symbol of defiance against the state. They weren't just outlaws. They were a force to be reckoned with, capable of taking on the might of the Brazilian military and surviving against all odds. Now, think about this. How would you use the power of weapons to fight a war where the enemy is always changing, always adapting? The cangaceiros didn't just rely on brute strength, they used their weapons as tools of psychological warfare, creating a reputation that made entire armies think twice before coming after them. The lesson here isn't just about firepower, it's about using what you have in the most strategic way possible. Every legend has its end, and for Lampião and his band of cangaceiros, that end came with a suddenness that shocked the entire Brazilian Northeast. After years of eluding the law, outwitting military forces, and maintaining a stranglehold on the land, the infamous band of outlaws was finally cornered. But how did this once feared gang, which had outlasted so many, fall? The story of the end of the cangaceiros is one filled with betrayal, tragedy, and the crushing weight of inevitability. By the late 1930s, the cangaceiros had become a symbol of resistance for the poor and disenfranchised in Brazil. Their brutal tactics and strategic genius made them virtually untouchable by the state's military forces. But even the greatest of empires can be toppled, and even the fiercest of gangs can be betrayed from within. The end for Lampião's gang came not through military force alone, but through the gradual erosion of their power and the collapse of the network that had kept them alive for so long. The turning point came when Lampião's position as the leader of the cangaceiros was finally challenged not by the law, but by a combination of internal strife, external pressure, and strategic mistakes. The gang had been fighting for so long that cracks had begun to appear. Betrayal and infighting were never far behind in any outlaw group. And in this case, some members of the gang began to question Lampião's leadership, while others saw it as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. The first blow to the cangaceiros came with the loss of one of their key members, the band's most trusted ally, and one of Lampião's closest confidants was killed under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was an ambush orchestrated by local authorities. Others claim that it was a betrayal within the gang itself. Regardless of the truth, this loss set off a chain reaction that weakened the unity of the cangaceiros. Without their most loyal and experienced members, the gang's grip on the region started to loosen. But it wasn't just internal strife that led to the downfall of the The Brazilian government had also stepped up its efforts to eliminate them. After decades of failed attempts, the government finally assembled a force capable of dealing with the outlaws. The military's tactics had evolved over time, and they began to target the cangaceiros with more precision, using the very strategies Lampião had once mastered. They adopted a more coordinated approach, tracking the gang's movements with unprecedented efficiency. The final blow came in 1938 in a remote area of the state of Sergipe, deep within the Brazilian Badlands. It was here, in the desert wilderness, where Lampião and his men had ruled for so long, that the cangaceiros would meet their end, despite their tactical genius and their ability to evade capture for so many years. The gang was ambushed by a well-coordinated military operation. The military had finally gained the upper hand, using intelligence gathered from informants, and the cangaceiros were caught off guard. What followed was the end of an era. Lampião, his beloved Maria Benita, and several other members of the gang were killed in the ambush. It was a bloody, brutal battle, and it marked the final chapter in the history of the cangaceiros. The bodies of Lampião and his gang were paraded through the streets as a symbol of the end of their reign, their deaths becoming a public spectacle designed to show that even the most feared band of outlaws could be brought to their knees. The aftermath of their deaths was a mixed one. On the one hand, the military and the government saw it as a triumph, an end to the terror that had plagued the region for so long. On the other hand, there were those who mourned the loss of Lampião, seeing him not as a criminal, but as a hero who had fought for the oppressed and defied the system. His death didn't end the myth of the cangaceiros, only cemented it. In death, Lampião became a martyr for the oppressed, a symbol of resistance that would live on in the legends of the region. But the cangaceiros' downfall was more than just a death. It was the end of an era. The military crackdown on the gang signaled the shift in power from the old ways of rebellion to the more modern forms of law and order that would dominate Brazil's future. The cangaceiros, with all their mysticism, brutality, and resistance, were replaced by a new order, more controlled, less romanticized vision of power. However, the cangaceiros' story didn't just disappear. Even in death, their legacy lived on. Their tactics, their audacity, and their defiance against the government became a symbol of rebellion that would continue to inspire future generations. The myths surrounding Lampião and his gang would only grow stronger, and even today, their story is told in hushed tones, a reminder of the power of the outlaw spirit and the unrelenting will to survive against all odds. When we reflect on the legacy of Lampião and his infamous band of cangaceiros, we are left with more than just tales of violence, brutality, and rebellion. What remains is a story of resilience, resistance, and the survival of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The cangaceiros were not just outlaws, they were symbols of defiance against an oppressive system, and their story offers valuable lessons that resonate even today. But what can modern outlaws, rebels, or those fighting against established power structures learn from their example? First and foremost, the cangaceiros teach us the importance of adaptation. While many of their contemporaries relied on brute strength and conventional warfare, Lampião's gang understood that survival depended on outwitting the enemy. They were masters of guerrilla tactics, ambushes, surprise attacks, and rapid retreats, using the terrain to their advantage and knowing when to fight and when to vanish into the wilderness. In a world where traditional methods of conflict often fail, the cangaceiros showed that the ability to adapt to the environment and the situation was the key to success. This ability to adapt was not just tactical, it was psychological as well. Lampião understood the power of fear. He used the reputation to control not only his enemies, but also the local population. By creating a legend of invincibility, Lampião ensured that his gang didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with the psychological advantage of terror. In the modern world, where information spreads faster than ever, understanding the power of reputation, the manipulation of fear, and the influence of psychological warfare is just as important as ever. But perhaps the most significant lesson we can learn from the cangaceiros is their unwavering commitment to their cause. despite the hardships, betrayals, and constant threat of death. The cangaceiros never wavered from their belief in their mission. Whether it was fighting against the government's oppression, protecting the poor from wealthy landowners, or simply surviving in a hostile environment, Lampião and his gang believed in the righteousness of their cause. Their loyalty to each other, to their code, and to their shared goal was what kept them going even when all seemed lost. In today's world, where the lines between right and wrong are often blurred, the cangaceiros' commitment to their mission serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of having a clear sense of purpose. Whether you are fighting for justice, standing up against tyranny, or simply trying to carve your own path in a complex world, the cangaceiros teach us that the most important thing is to believe in what you're doing, even when the odds are stacked against you. However, the cangaceiros also serve as a cautionary tale. Their brutal tactics, while effective in the short term, ultimately led to their downfall. Lampião's reign was marked by terror, and while his gang inspired fear in their enemies, it also created a legacy of violence that eventually caught up with them. The cangaceiros show us that while brutality may bring temporary success, it can also lead to isolation and eventual defeat. In the long run, it's the ability to evolve, to think strategically, and to build alliances that determines true success, not just the ability to strike fear into the hearts of others. In many ways, the cangaceiros also reflect the complexities of resistance movements today. The line between hero and villain is often drawn in shades of gray, and those who resist authority are not always seen as righteous figures. Lampião and his gang were viewed by some as heroes, while others saw them as nothing more than ruthless criminals. In the same way, modern-day rebels, revolutionaries, and outlaws are often vilified by those in power, even if their actions are driven by a sense of justice. The cangaceiros remind us that history is written by the victors, and the legacy of resistance is often shaped by those who survive to tell the tale. Finally, the story of Lampião and the cangaceiros serves as a reminder that legends are not born from victory alone. They are shaped by the narratives that follow. The cangaceiros, despite their brutal and violent nature, had become symbols of defiance, of standing up against oppression. They are remembered not just for their acts of violence, but for their resilience in the face of a system that sought to crush them. In this way, the legacy of the cangaceiros is as much about myth-making as it is about history. It is the stories we tell about those who resist power that shape the way we remember them. As you reflect on the legacy of the cangaceiros, think about the lessons they left behind. What can modern rebels, activists, or anyone standing up against injustice take away from their story? How can we learn from their strengths and their mistakes to build a better, more just world? If you've been with us through the entire journey of the cangaceiros' history, leave a comment below with your thoughts on their legacy and how it resonates with today's struggles. Let me know what part of their story spoke to you the most. And if you haven't already, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations into the most fascinating and untold stories of history. There's always more to discover. So check out the next video here on the side that delves even deeper into the world of outlaws and legends. Click and join me on that journey.